When we talk about serial killing today, we usually mean 3 or more murders committed over a period of time. The phrase sounds clinical, categorized, almost procedural, but that language is relatively new. In Germany, between the 1920s and 1950s, these crimes were more commonly described as Lustmord, literally meaning lust murder. The emphasis wasn't on repetition, it was on desire, on the idea that killing was driven by sexual impulse or gratification, which is often the case, but not always. Go back further into the 19th century and another term appears, ritual mord, literally meaning ritual murder. That phrase carried a very different weight back then. It wasn't just descriptive, it was ideological. In parts of Europe, accusations of so-called ritual murders were weaponized to justify violent persecution, particularly against the Jewish community. But as medicine and psychology advanced, explanations shifted. What had once been framed through superstition or conspiracy began to be interpreted through pathology, sexual deviance, and abnormal psychology. The language evolved, and with it, our understanding. Today, the term serial killing dominates, stripped of the overt moral panic, focused instead on behavioural patterns and repetition. Yet all these labels, ritual murder, lust mord and serial killing, circle the same phenomenon, repeated homicide shaped by something deeper than the act itself. With that said, there is still value in looking at serial murder through the lens of ritual, not in the narrow religious sense, but in its broadest psychological meaning. When investigators talk about ritual in serial killing, they are usually referring to what is known as a signature. Unlike modus operandi, which is practical and can evolve, a signature fulfills an emotional or psychological need. It is not required to complete the murder. In fact, it often increases risk, but the offender feels compelled to include it. That compulsion is key. Ritual behaviours are often rooted in fantasy, sometimes developed years before the first murder. The act becomes a way of externalizing an internal script, a private narrative involving control, power, humiliation, preservation, and sometimes even transformation. The signature is the emotional payload. Psychologically, ritual creates structure inside chaos. It gives the serial killer a sense of identity. Many serial offenders describe tension building before an attack, anxiety, intrusive fantasy, escalating obsession, and ritualized behavior helps regulate that internal pressure. Repetition reinforces the ritualized fantasy loop. Each crime feels less like improvisation and more like reenactment. Over time, the ritual can become more elaborate as the offender attempts to intensify or perfect the original psychological payload. That is why signature elements are often the most revealing part of a crime scene. They expose not just what a serial killer did, but shines a light on the fantasy that led them there. Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we'll be delving into one of the most disturbing cases of ritual in serial murder. This is the case of Herbert Baumeister. Due to the graphic nature of the crimes, viewer discretion is highly advised. And if you haven't done so already, hit subscribe now as we'll be dropping 2 videos per week. A man takes you home after a night out. He's pleasant enough, a little strange, but wealthy, confident, and he insists the night doesn't have to end. You arrive at a large property outside Indianapolis. There's a bar, a pool, and when you go downstairs, the space has been set up like a private nightclub. Then you notice something that doesn't quite fit. Several mannequins arranged around the pool and behind the bar. You think it's strange, but whatever, the drinks are flowing and the man seems chill. But at some point, the vibe changes from flirtation to control, from socialising to something more deliberate and darker. A rope tightens around your neck, and that's the last thing you'll ever feel. Years later, investigators would search that same property and recover more than 10,000 bones and bone fragments scattered across acres of woodland and farm. This is the case of Herbert Richard Baumeister and the ritualized, staged world he appears to have built beneath a family man mask. Herbert Baumeister was born in Indianapolis on April 7, 1947, to Elizabeth Baumeister and her husband, Dr. Herbert Eugene Baumeister, a very successful anesthesiologist. The oldest of 4 children, Baumeister's childhood was, by all accounts, normal. He grew up in an affluent suburb just north of Indianapolis, and there were no signs of abuse within the family home. His father was a hard worker, so much so that he often had little leisure time to spend with his children. His mother was a devoted housewife, loving and attentive, and she was said to have doted on her eldest boy. Little Herbert was talkative and friendly, and was not known to have gotten into trouble any worse than typical childhood antics. However, by the onset of adolescence, Baumeister began exhibiting antisocial behaviour and frequently showed no sign of having a sense of right or wrong. Though never a popular child in school, he still maintained a small circle of close friends who all appreciated his sense of humour, which was already dark and sometimes bizarre. No one suspected anything was amiss when Herbert's jokes grew more and more disturbing. They recalled how he used to ponder what it would be like to taste human urine, and even urinated on a teacher's desk for fun. As puberty intensified, he would routinely disrupt class with emotional outbursts. But more unsettling was his growing interest in dead animals. On one occasion, he happened upon the corpse of a small crow by the roadside. Waving away a swarm of dead flies, he picked up the dead animal and delighted at its pungent, decaying smell. It was a stench that made him want to get all inside the bird, to feel around its blood and organs. As he stared into the dead bird's eyes, an idea formed and a grin curled at the corner of his mouth. He stuffed the feathered corpse in his pocket and later placed it on a teacher's desk, to the shock of the whole class. The laughter he intended never arrived. Soon, more dead animals began appearing on the same teacher's desk every morning. At breaking point, the teacher contacted Baumeister's parents for help. Unsure of how to deal with his son, Baumeister's father took him to a psychiatrist who diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, which is the clinical term for psychopathy. Though by most accounts, he did not receive further psychiatric treatment for reasons unknown. It's important to pause here and note that there is no evidence that Herb suffered any major trauma in his formative years. He was treated well by his family and peers at school. There were no major head injuries or destabilizing moments that could have caused such a severe disturbance in his still developing brain. This is unusual among the panoply of other known serial killers, who almost always experience some form of abuse or trauma in childhood. For Herb, it seems everything took a dark turn at puberty. This poses the question, was Herb an embryo psychopath? After the bird incident, Herb returned to school and exhibited socially acceptable behaviour for a few years. However, remembered for his former unconventional behaviour, his high school peers gradually began to shun him, which led Herb to become aloof and reclusive. He graduated in 1965 at the age of 18 and went on to attend Indiana University, but dropped out after only one semester. In 1967, his father urged him to give university another go. Herb agreed, but again he flunked out after only one semester, later taking a job at the Indianapolis Star as a copy boy. It reported that his unpredictable behaviour and emotional outbursts continued in the workplace, unnerving his colleagues. During his brief stint at Indiana University, Herb met Juliana Satir, a high school journalism teacher and part-time student. The couple married in November 1971 and settled in the Steinmere neighbourhood in northeast Indianapolis, where they had 3 children. Shortly after his wedding, for 2 months in May 1972, Baumeister's father committed him to a psychiatric hospital due to severe depression. 1 month after his release, he enrolled at Butler University, but again repeated his earlier pattern of dropping out after 1 semester. Neighbours remembered him as eccentric, overly accommodating and hot-tempered. Outwardly, he slotted into ordinary life. What no one saw was the dark urges bubbling beneath the surface. Throughout the early 70s, he held jobs, sometimes struggled to get by, and even reinvented himself. In 1974, he got a job at the Indiana Bureau of Motor Vehicles, rising to program director, but was terminated in 1985 after increasingly erratic workplace behaviour, where he urinated on a letter to Governor Robert D. Orr and was held responsible for urine found months earlier on his manager's desk. Out of work again, Baumeister spent more and more time drinking in gay bars. He was arrested for a hit-and-run accident while drunk in September 1985 and for conspiracy to commit theft in March 1986. Both charges were later dropped. After that, he moved into the resale and thrift business, and in 1988 opened a thrift store called Save a Lot, borrowing money from his mother to initially fund the venture. The business did well enough that in 1991 the family moved to an 18-acre property in Westfield, Indiana, where Baumeister called Fox Hollow Farm. From the outside, Baumeister boasted a successful veneer, a husband, a father, a business owner living in the suburbs with acres of land. But this was also the period where his private life hardened into something predatory, including more and more time spent in gay bars and a pattern of disappearances that quietly began to stack up. By the summer of 1993, employees noticed Baumeister's mood swings, erratic behaviour, and long, unexplained absences during the workday. Financial pressures mounted, and lawsuits over unpaid services began stacking up. As the Save-A-Lot business faltered in the early 90s, a darker pattern was unfolding beyond the storefront. Between 1992 and 1994, a number of gay men were reported missing across the Midwest. Then, in November 1994, Baumeister's 13-year-old son discovered a human skull on the Fox Hollow Farm property. Baumeister dismissed it as part of a medical skeleton once owned by his father, and the matter initially went no further. Soon after, a witness came forward with a memory that suddenly carried new weight. In 1992, he had seen a man using the name Brian Smart leave an Indianapolis gay bar with Robert Goodlett, who disappeared shortly afterwards. At the time, the lead went nowhere, but in 1995, the witness encountered Brian Smart again at another bar. Suspicious, he followed him and noted the license plate number of the car. When police ran the registration, it came back to Herbert Baumeister. On January 4th, 1996, several months after police questioned Herb's wife about a possible link between her husband and the disappearances of several men, Julia Baumeister filed for divorce. Months later, she informed investigators about the skull found on the property and consented to a search of Fox Hollow Farm while her husband was out of town. One surviving witness later told investigators that when he visited Baumeister's home at Fox Hollow Farm, the basement pool area had been staged like a private club. There was a bar set up, low lighting, and multiple mannequins positioned around the room. The mannequins stood upright near the pool and behind the bar, arranged almost as if they were part of the scene. At the time, the witness found it strange but not threatening. That detail would later take on a greater significance once investigators began reconstructing what happened inside the home. In June 1996, authorities uncovered more than 10,000 charred and decomposed human bones and fragments, along with items including handcuff pieces and spent shotgun shells. After learning the police had issued a warrant for his arrest, Baumeister fled to Canada. He took his own life in Pinnery Provincial Park, Ontario, on July 3rd. In a 3-page suicide note, he mentioned remorse over the breakup of his marriage and the financial issues with his business. He made no mention of either the remains found on the property or his role in the missing person cases. That ending is part of what makes Fox Hollow Farm linger. He didn't just evade a trial. He took identities, motives, and potential connections with him. But Baumeister's story doesn't end here. In 1998, investigators publicly explored a possible link between him and the unsolved I-70 Strangler killings in Ohio. Between 1980 and 1991, the bodies of 11 men, many found partially nude, were discovered in rural areas along the Interstate 70 corridor. Each had been strangled. The similarities in victim profile and method drew attention, prompting authorities to examine whether Baumeister could be connected to those earlier murders. He had been known to travel in western Ohio during the years the killings occurred, and was also reported to frequent the Vogue Theatre, the last known location of victim Michael Riley before his disappearance in 1983. At the time, a witness described the man Riley left with, but no identification was made. Years later, when shown a photograph of Baumeister, the same witness identified him as a possible match. Investigators stated they believe Baumeister was responsible for the I-70 killings, though the cases have never been formally closed. What truly happened inside Baumeister's house in those final moments died with him and his victims. But even without a confession or testimony, when we examine the evidence, the witness accounts, and the investigative findings, a pattern emerges, and that pattern reveals something more than repetition. It reveals ritual. First, there's the constructed club environment. The indoor pool, the bar, the mannequins positioned like silent spectators. The witness description doesn't paint the picture of a chaotic basement or an improvised crime scene. It describes something curated, deliberate, a space designed to feel like a private extension of the nightlife outside, familiar enough to lower defences, controlled enough to isolate. That environment wasn't required to commit murder. It wasn't practical. It was psychological. It suggests a rehearsed fantasy, a world he built and returned to. That's signature behaviour. Not about efficiency, but about total immersion among his staged, silent witnesses. There's also the method of strangulation. It's significant because it's deeply intimate. It requires proximity, time, and sustained physical dominance. Unlike a weapon that creates distance, strangulation forces direct contact, often face to face. The offender feels resistance and weakening, feels the precise moment control becomes absolute. It's not sudden, it's prolonged. One witness described a sexualized danger zone, a scenario in which asphyxiation was introduced into their foreplay and intercourse. The witness expressed the belief that, had he been more impaired, he might not have survived. That detail matters. It indicates that strangulation, had become part of the psychological payload. And finally, there's the concealment. Not a single grave, not an attempt to distance himself from what he had done. Instead, a wide expanse of wooded property scattered with remains, fragments spread across the land behind his home. The crimes weren't hidden in some distant field miles away. They were on his property, within view of the life he presented to the world. Investigators have stated that the scale of recovered remains suggests at least 25 individuals may be represented, though confirmed identifications have taken decades and continue even now. In Baumeister's case, the ritual wasn't just the act itself, it was in the environment. The setting became part of the performance, and that setting, more than anything else, functions as his signature, the macabre atmosphere he had been cultivating from adolescence.